our day of retribution has come. And so we're taking Vienna, he said, like Napoleon.
Bernie Kratt to New Right pipeline. Is that real?
I mean, when I was like 18, I was like rocking with the Frankfurt School. I read like the Dialectic of Enlightenment. It seemed like salient. And for the record, I think the Jews have done a great job.
They've done a great job at what? Like the Zionism stuff?
Sure, the media.
Oh, doing the media. Welcome to Doomscroll. I'm your host, Joshua Citarella. My guest is Dasha Nekrasova, an actor, a film director, and a host of the Red Scare podcast.
And with Trump, I think, yeah, there was so much Democratic messaging. I mean, at the DNC, they talked about Trump constantly. They didn't have anything of substance really to say besides how bad Trump was and how bad Trump voters were. And I think just like with Hillary, like all the like basket of deplorable stuff, yeah, eventually people like saw that didn't really correspond with reality, and that Trump supporters were not the majority of people.
Yeah, it's hard to say that most people are political extremists. It's very difficult to maintain that narrative.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And then the Trump campaign also emerged as kind of when he started invoking common sense, and there was that video where he said like, we're the common sense party.
Was that a campaign ad? What was that?
It was a speech he gave at some rally, and he said like, who knows, maybe we're even a little liberal. Like they kind of, because the so-called left shifted so far, the GOP ended up being kind of like a centrist.
Shifted far on what, cultural issues?
Cultural issues mainly. I think the trans stuff people really didn't like.
As I remember, the Trump campaign that addressed that specifically was one of their more well-performing ads.
They stand for they, them.
Right.
The Democrats, stand for they, them, and I represent you.
Powerful phrase.
Yeah.
That's a powerful phrase.
Yeah. And the woke crap, people just like had fatigue with it.
How did you first become politicized?
I mean, when I was like 18, I was like rocking with the Frankfurt School. I read like the Dialectic of Enlightenment. It seemed like salient. I studied philosophy, and my focus was 19th century German, but Nietzsche specifically. But I don't think that had as much of an influence on me politically as it did aesthetically. Yeah, and then I guess, I was a Bernie Sanders supporter in 2016 because I was really broke and,
I appreciate the clarity.
I was operating on, in my self-interest like any person does. And so then I re-registered as a Democrat to vote for Bernie in the primaries.
I did the same thing.
Yeah. And then I guess after that point, it was more of like a disillusionment process politically. Disillusionment
with the Sanders campaign specifically, or with just...
With establishment politics, that you could actually, it seemed I did not foresee Trump winning in 2016.
Sure.
I was very like resigned to a Hillary win, which was really depressing.
How do you think of these things now when you reflect back on your humanities education, Frankfurt School, all of the ideas that you were, taught in philosophy?
I enjoyed college, I liked, I was pretty studious, and I think there's value in the humanities. But even then, I went to Berkeley City College before I transferred to Mills, which is a women's college. But like at Berkeley City College, which, it's berserkly, but they were like, that's where I was reading like Howard Zinn. I had like a teacher there assign me literally like an anarchist zine about like eating out of the trash. And even then, as like a 17, 18-year-old, I was like, this is pretty stupid. Like, I'm impressionable. But
you gotta pay how much tuition to be told to eat out of the trash?
Well, Berkeley City College is pretty reasonable.
Okay.
But yeah, And then Mills was pretty woke, but it was still kind of just, I graduated college in 2012. So at that point, like it hadn't really reached like a total fever pitch the way I hear it is in the universities now. And there was still space for what felt like discourse and, you know.
Do you feel like there's been a polarity shift of what constitutes the counterculture versus the time when we grew up and young people now?
Well, yeah, because I don't think that there's like a really a mainstream culture that feels cohesive enough for something to counter it. Everything feels pretty fragmented.
Was there a coherent mainstream during the era where we grew up? Or what comes to mind when you think of that?
I guess so. Right? Don't you think?
I mean, I would say that there was a sense that like kind of Bush evangelical Christianity was a hegemonic mainstream. And being young and radical meant being anti-war, for example.
Yeah, I remember reading that book, Everything You Know Is Wrong.
What is that?
It's called Everything You Know Is Wrong. It's like a collection of essays, like when I was like 13 or something then.
Okay,
and that felt very like, yeah, counter to, even when I read like Howard Zinn as an older teen, you know, I was like, oh my God.
And so that was like in some ways a formative experience, this like dissident collection of essays at age 13?
Yeah, that there were alternate narratives.
Yeah.
But they felt more like samizdat. They felt more like, and now I think there's only alternate narratives.
One of the questions that we tend to ask people on the podcast is how you draw these lines between subculture and mainstream culture, because we exist in this pretty unique period where we have quantitative data about how big alternative media is, and it is now just larger than what we consider the mainstream.
Yeah.
And so we don't really have terms to describe the media landscape that we live in now, right? Like, what does it mean when a Joe Rogan episode gets more views than like MSNBC? You know, what is mainstream? What is subcultural? What is countercultural? A lot of that becomes unclear. And there was maybe an easier contrast in the past where it was like, oh yeah, like Bush evangelical Christianity was like the thing to rebel against.
I didn't have, because I grew up in Las Vegas. I didn't have that influence.
What is countercultural in Las Vegas?
Being a meth head or... But yeah, there wasn't, I knew that was, yeah, something that was like part of America, but I never really experienced it personally.
In this online landscape, there are different affordances than maybe the media environment that we grew up in, where you would be assigned, for example, like an anarchist zine in college. Things move much more quickly. This is what we call an attention economy. Within that attention economy, there are certain incentives where people will make radical, sensational statements to even people who have extreme beliefs will overstate their politics comedically. How do you interpret the statements that people make online? Like, do you feel like, or how do you sort the fact from fiction when someone is doing irony or comedy or when they mean something for real?
Yeah, there was a term for this in the late Soviet period called styob, which referred to a kind of like a style of humor or rhetoric, like at the tail end of the Soviet Union when no one really like believed in anything anymore. Sincerity and irony kind of collapsed. And it also involved things like, yeah, like kind of like over-identifying with a certain politics, like, but with like nuance and ironic sentiment, I guess.
There's been somewhat of a transformation of the political parties in the last few years. People talk about the political realignment. We have historic margins for working class people voting for the Republicans. We basically have historic margins for everyone voting for the Republicans at this point.
Yeah.
Is there something about this where the Democratic Party itself has changed within, you know, maybe your and my lifetime, maybe before that even?
Yeah, I guess I think they just became sort of the status quo. A lot of the messaging I felt of the Democratic Party in this election also was about being like civil and decent, and they trusted that people just would continue to vote for them because they said that they were good, or at least that the other party was bad, and that just wasn't sustainable.
What do you think of Luigi Mangione and the alleged murder of the United Healthcare CEO?
Oh, you mean alleged murder?
Well, he hasn't been convicted yet, so I have to say that or I'm going to get sued.
Right. But he seems like he did it. He shot him.
Well, I'll tell them to sue you now. I'm still saying alleged.
You're supposed to say alleged. Okay. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think he is confused.
Confused how?
I mean, I know he's like is enjoying a lot of popular support. And when it first happened, I thought like, oh, this healthcare CEO must have like done something. He must have really wronged this guy, you know, like he did something really like personal. I just watched that movie John Q, actually, where Denzel Washington holds a hospital hostage because his son has a heart condition. He's dying. He needs a heart transplant. And I think it's Anne Heche. She's like a bitch from the insurance company, and she's like, healthcare is not free. You know, and she's like, when you get your son out of here, kill him, basically, you know? But it's like, I was like, oh, that's what Luigi, like, thinks is going on with Brian Thompson, that he's, like, personally, you know, looking him in the eyes and saying, like, you don't get to go to the doctor? But I think people have very legitimate grievances with healthcare, of which insurance is a big part. But Luigi himself also, wasn't he from also, like, a very rich family?
He could, likely afford whatever he needed. Yeah.
So that is a little confusing to me.
You say he seems confused. Have you, are you guessing about his like political worldview, motivations, things like this?
Well, like his manifesto, who, the targets of political violence ought to be, if his goals are to like rectify or enact some kind of like justice. I don't think Brian Thompson was like a virtuous person probably, but it's hard to make the case. So yeah, he more than like a pharma CEO deserved to die.
Yeah, he seems to have targeted him based on the market share of United Healthcare. So, person at the top of the food chain for the biggest company. But his motivations are quite unclear. The response online, however, is overwhelmingly clear.
Yeah.
What do you make of this overwhelming support?
People like a folk hero, they have a ton of frustrations, like I said, with their insurance carriers and healthcare broadly. So people feel some like vindication, or like that they think there's some justice in it, clearly.
And does that seem to be coming from people with a particular political leaning, sentiment?
It seems like it's nonpartisan, exactly. Though probably more people on the left with like who have acquired class consciousness.
He's not a class struggle kind of guy, though, Luigi.
He's not?
Like, no, not at all. Yeah. I mean, if anything, he's like a kind of center-right rationalist as far as we can tell from, his media diet and things like this.
I mean, I think he was a normie who had a back injury and he wasn't cut out for the incel lifestyle. And so then he started experimenting with ayahuasca and like psychedelic drugs, and that's what drove him crazy.
They do say that. That's a possibility.
And then
the one-shot thesis.
Yeah, exactly. He got one-shotted. I think it gives him like a popular and convenient motive to target like a healthcare CEO.
You have been circulated on the internet for statements surrounding healthcare, memes no doubt people are familiar with. Do you have a preferred solution for the crisis of American healthcare now?
I do want people to have healthcare, honey. I mean, I meant it when I said it. Anna actually asked me if I thought Luigi had seen the Sailor Socialism video, which I'm is likely. No, I didn't have a solution then.
A preferred solution.
I mean, it seems like there should be some kind of universal health care, but it's so complicated. It's, it's easy to say that, but it's like, I mean, as a Russian person, I don't even like going to the doctor, and I think that in addition to healthcare being inaccessible and unaffordable, it's also like people are overdiagnosed, overprescribed, there's over medicalization as well.
Yeah.
So it's like a huge, but yeah, I think ideally there needs to be some kind of universal healthcare. You can't but I think also people should be able to opt into expensive, luxurious insurance if they choose to, but insurance is so exorbitant. It feels like you're paying, it feels like you're betting on getting sick, which I think is.
You are, yeah.
Yeah, which, I don't know. I'm feeling lucky.
That's okay. Well, occasionally you are not lucky. So, I mean, I think in fairness, socialized medicine is not really a controversial issue on anywhere along even the center spectrum. The writer of which Luigi was a big fan, a founding member of his Substack, Gurwinder Bhogal, is a kind of rational centrist, gray tribe type one of these guys. Center right leaning, but he supports socialized medicine. I think a lot of people do. But there's a spectrum of proposals for these things.
Canada's a mess, right? And then the Soviet Union didn't really have great healthcare. And the reality of truly social, the state controls every aspect of healthcare is the state will let you die if you're not useful.
The private sector will do that as well.
Well, at least you can pay them to keep you alive. At least you have an I'm saying it's I'm pro options.
I mean, I think of and I know people in Canada who have had trouble with their healthcare system, so it's not a utopian dream by any stretch of the imagination.
Just put you in the euthanasia pod.
That is fucked up. I'm opposed to that. But I think of when you were a waitress, for example, when I was a precarious freelancer, it wouldn't matter how shitty the healthcare system was. I would have benefited from going to the doctor,
Why?
Even if because I fucking broke my toe and I had to go to work for 6 weeks, even if I got bad care, that would be better than no care.
But couldn't you go to an emergency room?
You could, yeah, but then you're slapped with this super expensive bill and you know.
Send that to my house. I'll definitely open it.
Yeah. I mean, I think we might need a more substantial solution than just ignoring the medical debt.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't have one.
Yeah.
But I do, want people to have care. But going to the doctor makes you sick sometimes.
I know people who've been overtreated. I was overtreated myself for many years, actually. My doctor was sued later, 10 years later.
See?
We only found out. So these things do indeed exist, but my foot still hurts. So I would have preferred to go to the doctor. It's okay. I'm a big boy. Don't worry about it. Some of your beliefs have kind of transformed over the last few years. So maybe medicine, as an example, is something that has remained more or less constant, but you have, I would describe, drifted in your political beliefs. Is there a certain experience or moment that made you reconsider your political commitments from before?
I mean, I didn't have real political commitments, And I don't think I've really, I think as we were talking earlier about this alignment shift, I don't feel like I have my personal beliefs or politics have changed so much. The center has just shifted. Culture war stuff, the status quo, I'd say, is more like left liberal leaning, and has become increasingly so. I guess, I mean, people get more conservative when they get older. I think that's kind of natural. But I still wouldn't describe myself as like a conservative or even as like affiliated with the right. And I was sort of like nominally affiliated with the left, but I can't really say that I had like real convictions.
I mean, you did just go to this like Young Republicans gala. Like you are affiliated, then that you're in attendance, right?
Yeah, well, they invited me.
I think that qualifies as affiliation.
Sure.
Are people becoming more fiscally progressive, would you say? More populist in their economics?
Seems that way. Seems like a lot of people are down really bad and no longer feel that the Democrats, are going to like alleviate their suffering.
They might be right about that.
Mm-hmm.
I've spent a lot of time interviewing young people in the last few years. And I think one of the underlying assumptions for people getting more conservative as they get older is acquiring property, owning a home, something like that. But the downward mobility of a lot of these young people, like they may be renters forever, So I wonder if that kind of trajectory can actually happen, if they will make that leap if they don't acquire home ownership, for example.
I mean, I'm not a homeowner. I don't have a savings account. I think even if you have a family or, you just, the longer you're alive, the more invested you are in, sort of in literally conserving something. So you want more, you don't want like political instability.
Yeah, even if you have like a small amount, just subsistence level, you want to hold on to that.
Yeah.
Up until most people don't have subsistence level.
And then, yeah. Then I guess there's like collective revolt.
Well, we've been doing the politics podcast for a little bit now, but we both come from this background of culture. You're an actor, a director, I'm an artist. I find it peculiar that in this political moment, a lot of the commentary comes from comedians, people who are cultural producers of some sort. What role should cultural producers have in political discourse? Like, how much should celebrities weigh in, for example?
I think, yeah, actors can go, it's a little tedious, They're not known for their like amazing minds. They have a different kind of intelligence. But it would be nice if there was like, I don't know, like robust public dialogue, from people that weren't, just like politicians.
I feel like to a certain degree, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, like your job and my job would have been filled by a journalist who went to school for journalism, for example. Like, why isn't that happening more?
What would we be doing?
I'd be making art and you would be acting and we could shut the fuck up about politics.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I went to school, I wanted to be like a professor.
In philosophy or
Yeah, that's what I
okay.
thought I would do, is like go just kind of so naive, yeah. I thought there'd be like an ivory tower for me to be in.
Right.
But why are cultural producers sort of, I don't know. I mean, someone like Rogan, podcasts have a very like parasocial function in people's lives, which I think heightens their influence. And someone like Rogan, he produces so much content, and he's so good at what he does that he's become a celebrity by virtue of him basically just being kind of like a curious guy.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a defense of him a few years ago when they were trying to put warning labels on his podcast, which I thought was a terrible mistake.
Yeah,
so
that's crazy.
I broadly agree with you on that. I think the underlying question here is like, well, why is it that a comedian is so influential as compared to like a columnist or I don't know, a kind of cultural writer? Why is there not like a Jack Kerouac of this generation, like someone who does literature proper?
I mean, I don't know, there's some young novelists out there. There seems to be like a resurgent interest in literature. I think in part because the art world is so unviable.
Is literature more viable?
Huh?
Is literature more viable than art
There's
now?
less overhead,
Yeah, but you can
and
sell a
like
painting for a lot.
I know, but like for people who like want to go to like an art show or like a reading, they get more narcissistic fulfillment maybe from writing poetry or something.
I mean, I always thought of it as like there's no money to be made in poetry, so it is exclusively the pursuit of people who come from intergenerational wealth.
Yeah.
Where at least there are these kind of like, bootstrapping entrepreneur artists who can, in some cases, sell paintings for a lot of money and
Right.
might not come from that crazy background. So I always thought that the literature people were like, what do they call it? Stealth wealth.
That might be true, yeah. Yeah.
Is woke over?
That's what I hear. I heard it's dead, yeah. I think so, but I think it's like we had culture wars in the 90s, and then we had like the glorious era of like South Park and Eminem and Tom Green. I don't,
Right.
there was more kind of like, I feel like things like ricocheted and things got really like fun and kind of like naughty. Maybe it's like clouded by my like memory as a child, but I think like woke is over, because most people just don't want it.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the millennial experience of us both coming from creative backgrounds. You had mentioned before about hoping to graduate into a world that had this ivory tower for you, becoming a professor or something like that. And it just doesn't seem like any of those institutions, journalism, music, art, whatever it is, they're just not open to young people coming in, right? And so what begins to happen in a society like that is that you get these formations of counter elites who then build new structures, try to overthrow the existing order. And surprise, surprise, that is also a political project. Do you have much faith in any of the existing institutions now? Like, are some of these places worth saving?
Yeah. I mean, I believe like in the academy as an idea, and in Hollywood, as show business as an idea. And I mean, this happened in the 70s with the studio systems in the late 60s becoming really bloated and ineffective. And
What happened for, I don't know the history of film, but in the 70s?
like the new wave of like indie, like Easy Rider, Bonnie and Clyde, like more like indie movies started coming out that people, Taxi Driver, like, whereas prior movies were made much the way that they are now, almost like by committee, by these like, massive studio conglomerates. And now there's like parallels sort of with streaming, where is a lot of content being produced, but no one's really consuming it. And then getting small to medium budget films financed is basically impossible.
I don't know from personal experience, but this is what I hear.
And so I think they do need to be preserved in some way, even though they need to be reformed. But I'm in a union. I'm like, I'm still, trying to work in the film industry.
Yeah, I guess it's useful at some point to separate like a Hollywood production company as an institution from the Washington Post, for example.
Yeah.
Right? Like some institutions are worth saving, others are not.
Sure.
Not all are created equal.
Right.
Have you had problems with like shadow ban or deplatforming? Or to my knowledge, I don't think that you have. Like you wouldn't need an alternative platform.
I think I was shadow banned on my first Twitter account. And so then I started posting on my alt a couple years ago. And now I just use that as my main. But no, we've never been deplatformed or anything like that.
Right. Because one of the kind of driving forces behind this stuff is that people lose access to the ability to publish. And then they found these new institutions.
Right.
So, speaking of Hollywood, why does all of academia and the movie industry sound like radical anarchists right now?
'Cause they're good little foot soldiers that do as they're told.
And foot soldiers for who?
For the regime.
The regime. Pray tell, what is the regime in this case?
He like liberal consensus, status quo stuff. That, I don't think I sounded but I meant, there's just like, they are invested in these systems, so they have to believe the things that they espouse, or at least proclaim to. I mean, I think Israel really threw a wrench in the gears, in terms of like wokeism, leftism, whatever you want to call it, within the entertainment industry.
In how do you mean like that people
that Palestine can't be like the cause célèbre of like a such a Jewish institution
in Hollywood. Similar thing in art, that there's a large Zionist collector base that will use their power in the market, liquidate works by artists that they politically disagree with.
Right.
Why is that issue just apart from all others, like the single like flashpoint in every cultural industry?
Josh, come on.
I should have asked a different
question.
Come
on.
That's not. That's not in my notes, but that was.
You know why?
Where are we? Okay, so.
And for the record, I think the Jews have done a great job.
They've done a great job at what, like the Zionism stuff?
I'm sure the media.
Doing the media. Yeah. The media is in like the news media or like the movies?
All of it. Well, in general.
It's just the whole media.
The Hollywood, yeah. Yeah.
Did you see this thing recently that the CCP is now putting funding into their, like, I don't know what they call their Hollywood, but they're putting state funding into making movies?
No, I did not. That's interesting.
That's pretty substantial.
Yeah.
Right? What should we expect from Trump in 2025? Do you expect that he's going to govern like a populist? Like there's a lot of this rhetoric that's going around now about, creating jobs, reshoring industry, this kind of thing.
I hope so. Unlike 2016, 2020, he really has people behind him that I think will be effective.
Do you believe the RFK line that he didn't expect to win in 2016 and so just kind of picked people out of a hat?
Trump? No. I think he was just fringe, and like Roger Stone was the only one who like, not the only one, but like Sean, he had more fringe kind of people. Though Bannon's back in the fold.
Right.
And he gave a speech at the Republican Gala that was very much about populism.
I've seen a lot of his film. I feel like I have a decent grasp of his like belief system, but it felt like that element of Trumpism had kind of waned at a certain point in like the 2016 arc. But what was that? What was the context of his speech? I haven't seen it yet.
He was the keynote speaker. It was pretty vengeful, but it was
Vengeful towards who?
it's towards, our day of retribution and has come. And so we're taking Vienna, he said, like Napoleon. But yeah, I know he said the Young Republicans Club had built like a massive populist alliance that was multi-ethnic, that included all these demographics, and that this was what like populism is.
In fairness, they are gaining the voting share with a lot of those different groups. I would say it's still not a majority, but if you just look at 16, 20, 24, it's like, I think it's something like 47% of Latino men voted for Trump now, which is like, that's basically half. Right?
Yeah.
That's the most pronounced demographic.
Totally.
James Pogue writes about this Bernie Krat to New Right pipeline. Is that, well, one, is that real? Do you think that's a plausible narrative? And two, how do you explain that cultural shift that people make?
I think it's fairly real, but I think it's due in large part to what I was saying earlier about there being like a political realignment, that, the campaign that Bernie was running on in 2016, which changed a lot in 2020, but it was very populist. It was very working class centric. It makes sense that those people would now find Trump's messaging resonant.
Yeah, I feel like I have a stronger grasp on working people who have anti-establishment politics. Like I understand that, but there's also something of a drift within like...
Don't you think Trump is anti-establishment?
To a degree, but we can equivocate on what we mean by the word establishment, right? So, I think like a lot of his policy the first time around looked very much like, a Republican austerity. It didn't feel like populist, heterodox economics. And some of the appointments, I've heard you talk about this a bit, but there's some surprising picks in these appointments that might look something more like the rhetoric and the promises of 2016, but I have to say I'm pretty skeptical about it. I'm more so interested in the thought leaders and the kind of cultural shift rather than like the popular shift between those poles. I've seen my own friends kind of make this leap, and in 2024 more people came out unironically for Trump, and they were Bernie people before, 8 years ago, 4 years ago.
Rogan really came in at the 11th hour. I don't know. I think it's not so much that there have been like specific thought leaders. I guess you could say me and Anna have some part in like a reactionary sentiment amongst like Manhattanites. But that's ultimately still very small in the grand scheme of things. I really do think it's just that like the Democrats felt more and more like out of touch. And the same things that people like responded to in Bernie, that he, seemed to have convictions and, wasn't like a political outsider, but he had, didn't behave the way a normal politician does, I think people see that in Trump and like that about him as well.
We know a lot of people who have relatively small audiences, move in niche intellectual, artistic circles, but the amount of press that these things get are sometimes substantial. How many articles are written about downtown culture every year? Right? Quite a bit. So disproportionate influence, but maybe a small audience. You exist somehow at like both ends of this spectrum, though, very uniquely positioned, where you do have a mass audience, but then you also move in these like, cultural milieus that are relatively small. Which one of those do you feel is more influential and effective now? This kind of like elite culture, poetry, art, intellectual circles in New York versus giant popular podcasts?
I mean, if the podcast wasn't in New York, I don't think it would be as popular as it is. I don't think it would have accrued the audience that it did. And that New York is still the center of like media production. And that is significant. And amongst, these like niche, seemingly elitist milieus, there is kind of like a cultural trickle down.
Yeah, when did that, this like distrust in editors and curators peak? When do you think that started to decline?
I really don't know. Maybe like after 2016, like the Trump derangement syndrome.
I mean, there were signs in 2015, but I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah, the like so much energy being spent on like the hashtag resistance in the art world and in media is like, I think unsustainable.
Do you think we're going through something of like a cultural backlash in creative spheres, creative industries? The mutual friend of ours wrote an article that you will discuss at length in a future appearance, but I think there's a very clear sentiment that programming in cultural institutions has been dominated by a few core themes in the last few years. And there seems to be a growing support of people who are sick of that for one reason or another. There's a variety of criticism from both the left and right, but many people have kind of speculated that there is this like backlash that is now emerging.
I don't see it so much yet, but I think it will happen, yeah. But isn't it ultimately about like money?
That is, I mean, behind the scenes, that's what I hear from a lot of the people who work in museums and cultural institutions, that the donors are fed up with being scolded, essentially.
Yeah.
And that maybe makes sense. Is that the case in the film world for investors, or?
It's hard to say. In part because I'm not privy to those conversations necessarily, but there's still, I think, a lot of like groupthink in the entertainment industry, at least. And in the arts, maybe, like the donor class will ultimately be responsible for there being a backlash or a kind of like shift away from DEI style representation in arts, I guess.
How do you expect Trump will behave with Ukraine? Is he going to cut funding as he promises?
Again, I hope so. Yeah, I think he will. I hope he ends the war, yeah. That was one of the reasons I voted for him.
We have another very expensive war going on now in Israel. Do you think he'll continue support for Israel?
Me?
Trump. You can answer it as well. If you...
Yeah. I think I wouldn't even say I support Israel. I just they seem too big to fail. I think there might be some kind of like end to the war, but the United States will continue to support the state of Israel.
I mean, I think there's going to be an end to the war when there's no Palestinians left, unfortunately.
But I mean, I guess like the act of, I don't know. There will be some diplomacy that's ultimately meaningless.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling of Trump telling Netanyahu that he needs to end the war, is
Freudian slip.
You got to wrap it up and just get rid of him, is, I think, between the lines.
Really?
That's my feeling of it. Yeah.
I think they're just
it's bad optics to kill so many people.
It's definitely bad optics to kill so many people.
Right.
So I think they'll just keep, I think there'll still be, it'll be what it was before. Probably. That's my prediction.
I mean, there's not much left of it. It's gonna be pretty different from before.
I mean, geopolitically, like, you know, they'll continue to live under Israeli occupation.
Right. So we were both of a generation where we were largely politicized offline, but we were, early onto social media. Facebook was an important part of meeting people when we grew up. Do you know anyone now who's younger and got politicized online and turned out normal?
Well, it's like kind of the new normal, right?
Is that good?
It is what it is. I don't know. I think, yeah, I don't know. One of the things that makes me optimistic about the Trumpian era, and maybe this is naive, but I think will be like a post-political time.
What do you mean by post-political?
Like politics won't be so charged. And people won't feel such a need to like identify themselves with political factions or take some, principled stance on global or domestic politics.
What do you think about this phrase hyperpolitics that people throw around?
What does that mean?
It's like everything is this kind of exaggerated performance of politics without any real struggle over resources.
Yeah. Sounds about right.
Does it make sense to call it post-political or just the absence of hyperpolitics?
I guess maybe, yeah, the latter, the absence of hyperpolitics. I mean, the absence of like the TDS this time around, I feel like a lot of people are just, it's been a long 8 years. It's been a long election year. And most people would be happier not having politics.
They are sick of it a little bit. Yeah, no, I hear that. Okay, well, we've kind of gone through this arc of skepticism of institutions, people moving onto platforms to continue their creative careers during ecosystems that won't support them. What type of like ethics and responsibility, if de facto as influencers and content creators, we are now, for better or worse, filling the role that journalists, editors, curators used to do in generations past? Like, how do we produce quality information that then shapes, informs political subjects in the future?
I mean, I don't see myself really that way. I guess I still see myself primarily as like an entertainer. And so the quality of my information and platform is kind of has to do with my performance and my ability to like entertain people. But yeah, I don't see myself as doing necessarily like hard-hitting reporting. Even when I have like an interview subject, I'm usually like trying to, it's the radio. I'm trying to do like a radio show. And like my ultimate responsibility is to entertain rather than to like inform.
Right.
And to be honest.
I hesitate to make the argument because I do believe that people who are involved in culture should have an active role in the discourse. Like that's basically my education came from the art world, so I would be hypocritical if I said that I didn't think cultural producers should be involved in the discourse, because that's how I got educated. That's what I do. Just practically speaking, like there is this void in the discourse. It's being filled by people who make culture rather than our proper journalists. And so at what point do we begin to apply those standards to ourselves and what we publish? So, I really feel like a lot of the art I made when I was younger, I was a provocateur, right? Like I was trying to get a rise out of people. I was making critical points through my art and so on. But as the platform has grown, I now feel like we published a podcast a few weeks back that had a pretty big factual error in it. And, you know, I now feel a kind of responsibility with the scale of the audience, right? So when do we begin to apply those like old school legacy ethics of journalism to the stuff we do now based on the scale of our audience?
What was the factual error?
Well, it's more than one, actually. Robin DiAngelo got paid by, I think it's Matt Walsh, who's the guy.
Am I Race?
Am I Race? Yeah, he paid her some fee to appear on the podcast. And we mistakenly published, I mean, we don't have somebody on salary to fact check shit. You know, it's like a small podcast. But the way that we described it was that she got kind of pranked and paid the publication, the production.
Right.
And we were just backwards on it, so.
Yeah.
But there's also, you know, there were a few, like mainstream media loves to harp on this, but factual errors in some of the like bro populism podcasts that Trump appeared on in advance of the election the week before. But I mean, where do you fall on these things? Like when do, you know, are we now the adults in the room and we have to take responsibility for journalism?
I don't want to. I mean, yeah, I think just if you're honest, if you just say you don't know, then you can, you know, say whatever.
Hard to do that on the smaller channels because the incentives are, you know, pretty steep for being, you know, very stringent on certain issues.
I mean,
people don't like to hear, I don't know.
People don't listen to my show because me and Anna are like exceptionally well informed, and doing like the weekly kind of like topical discursive thing. Yeah, we're really coming in shooting from the hip. And I think that that's partly why we're so popular. And it's not because of like the quality of information that people are getting necessarily, though sometimes we make salient points, you know, we've been vindicated many times. But yeah, I think it's more like about force of like personality and like perspective. You're offering a perspective that like implicitly is yours. And so like objectivity, I mean, this is very postmodern, but there's, like, I don't think objectivity needs to be the goal just because you're producing cultural output.
Dasha, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great to see you.
Thanks for having me.